Ever feel like you're lost in a maze when you try to figure out how well your team's actually performing?
Oh, yeah. It's like drowning in data, you know?
Totally. We're diving into that today, trying to find a way out of that data overwhelm. We'll ditch those old dusty metrics that aren't doing anyone any favors.
Right. They're like a chocolate teapot useless.
Exactly. We're going to figure out how to build a system that really gets your team where it needs to be, and we've got the perfect guide for this. Mastering Team Performance Metrics.
That's a good one. It gets at something I see so often, teams struggling to shake off old habits.
For sure. Like, you know how everyone always talks about the importance of teamwork, but then we fall back on those employee of the month things.
It's so counterproductive.
The book actually calls this out as like, we're hardwired for individual competition when the real magic happens when everyone's working together.
100%.
And that even messes with how we measure performance, you
Yeah.
know? Instead of this big messy spreadsheet, mastering team performance metrics wants us to think of it more like a GPS.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Right. Always adjusting, always guiding you toward where you need to go.
Makes you think about those old paper maps, huh? Useless now.
So how do we ditch the paper map, so to speak, and get our hands on that GPS for our teams?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Well, this book breaks it down into 5 main types of metrics every team leader needs to have on their radar. Time-related, quality-related, scope-related, cost-related, and this is a big one-team related.
It's like having all the right tools in your toolkit, yeah.
Exactly. Speaking of tools, you mentioned in your notes that you've been dealing with some frustrating project delays.
Ugh, don't even get me started. It's been a constant battle.
Well, time-related metrics are key for getting those under control, and mastering team performance metrics dives deep into that. Have you ever tracked things like cycle time?
We have, kinda. I mean, we track how long things take, but I'm not sure we're really digging into the why behind it all.
That's where the real magic happens, though. The book compares it to having a fancy sports car, but never shifting out of first gear.
Mm.
You got to analyze that data, see where the bottlenecks are.
Totally. And it's not always about just going faster either, you know? Sometimes rushing leads to mistakes.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah.
We once had this project where we were so focused on hitting this insane deadline that we totally skimped on quality. It was a disaster.
Ouch. Yeah. Those are tough lessons to learn.
It took months to rebuild that client relationship. We definitely learned that quality matters just as much, if not more, than speed.
100%. And that's where understanding things like customer satisfaction, that CS score, can be a game changer.
Okay, so tell me more about that. How do you measure something like customer satisfaction? I mean, it seems kind of like subjective.
Well, you can use tools like surveys. Ask your clients directly about their experience. That direct feedback is pure gold.
Makes sense. So it's not just about delivering on time, but also making sure what you deliver is actually good.
Exactly. You want them to be so happy they shout it from the rooftops.
Right, like raving fans. And there are ways to measure that too, right? The book mentions something called the Net Promoter Score.
I've heard of that, but honestly, no clue what it actually is.
So basically, it boils down to asking your clients one question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend?
Interesting. So a high score means you're not just meeting expectations, you're like blowing them out of the water.
Exactly. It means they love you, they trust you, and they're willing to put their own reputation on the line to recommend you.
That's powerful. And on the flip side, a low score is a pretty clear sign that something needs to change.
It's like a giant warning sign flashing, right? But what's cool is that mastering team performance metrics emphasizes that these metrics shouldn't be kept secret.
Oh, you mean actually share them with your team?
Exactly. It's about creating transparency and using that data to work together to get better.
Instead of just freaking everyone out with a bad score, use it as a learning opportunity.
Exactly. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about how much work is actually getting done. Because let's be real, deadlines matter. That's where those scope-related metrics come in. Ever looked at your team's velocity?
I've heard the term thrown around, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure what it means in a practical sense. Sounds very scientific.
It's simpler than it sounds.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Velocity measures how much work your team can realistically handle in a certain amount of time.
So like a sprint or a quarter.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Like how much can they actually get done without burning out or sacrificing quality?
Okay, that makes sense. So how do you figure that out?
There are different ways, but the book talks about using something called story points. Each task gets a point value based on how complex it is.
So you're not just looking at the number of tasks, but also how hard they are.
Exactly. It gives you a much more realistic picture.
Yeah.
But And this is a big but. The book cautions against getting too caught up in just churning out a ton of work.
Right, because quality over quantity, we've already been down that road.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where you're consistently delivering amazing work without burning your team out.
Sustainable success. Love it.
But we all know we can't talk about performance without talking about the financial side of things,
The
right?
bottom line.
Exactly. Time to talk cost-related metrics.
Show me the money.
Right. Got to make sure those numbers look good. But there's more to it than just profit, right?
Totally. We can't forget about the people doing the work. Got to make sure they're thriving, not just surviving. Mastering team performance metrics actually digs into that.
Which is perfect because I know that's something you're passionate about, creating a positive and supportive team culture.
100%. I want people to actually enjoy coming to work,
Absolutely. And it turns out you can actually use metrics to help you build that kind of environment. Mastering team performance metrics calls these team-related metrics. What do you think about that? Have you ever used data to assess your team's dynamics?
I mean, we've done those satisfaction surveys, but I've never thought about it quite like that.
It goes way beyond just asking, are you happy? It gets into things like team velocity. You heard of that?
Okay, yeah. Isn't that just about how quickly the team gets things done?
It's more nuanced than that. It's about how smoothly they work together as a unit, how well they communicate, how they handle roadblocks, that kind of thing.
So it's less about individual superstars and more about how well the whole team functions.
Exactly. The book even talks about something called a collaboration index.
Okay, now you're just making things up. A collaboration index. What is that?
I know, right? It sounds kind of made up, but it's actually fascinating. The book talks about using data to track things like how evenly distributed workloads are, how well people communicate, even how they handle disagreements.
Wow. So it's like a holistic view of how the team interacts?
Exactly. And by measuring it, you can actually pinpoint areas where things could be improved.
I like it. Instead of just guessing, you have some real data to work with.
Right. It takes the guesswork out of it. Now, all of this is great in theory, but how do we actually put it into practice?
Yeah, that's always the challenge, isn't it? Bridging that gap from like the textbook to the real world.
Totally. And mastering team performance metrics actually provides a really clear roadmap for doing just that.
Ooh, lay it on me.
So step one, according to the book, is alignment. You got to be crystal clear on what your organization is trying to achieve before you even think about picking a single metric.
Makes sense. Everything you measure should be driving towards those bigger goals.
Exactly. And that's where things like SMART goals come in. Making sure those goals are specific, measurable.
Achievable, relevant, and time-bound. I know the drill.
And the book takes it a step further and shows you how to directly connect those SMART goals to the specific metrics you're tracking. It's brilliant, actually.
So you're not just measuring for the sake of measuring. Everything has a purpose.
Exactly. But with all this data flying around, it's easy to get overwhelmed, right? That whole data overload thing we talked about earlier.
Tell me about it. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in spreadsheets.
The book talks a lot about using technology to help you manage all that data. You mentioned you were already using project management software.
Yeah, we got all the fancy tools, but honestly, I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what they can do.
You and me both.
Yeah.
But the book makes a really good point about choosing the right tools.
Oh, you mean it's not just about getting the shiniest, most expensive thing out there?
Exactly. It's about finding what works best for your team and your workflows.
Because a tool is only as good as the person using it, right?
100%. And even with the most amazing tech in the world, it all comes back to communication. You got to make sure your team understands not only what you're measuring, but why it matters.
Because otherwise it's just a bunch of meaningless numbers, right?
Exactly. It's about getting everyone on board and working together towards the same goals.
Easier said than done sometimes. People can be pretty resistant to change.
Oh, tell me about it. But this book has some good advice for dealing with that too. It all starts with getting people involved right from the beginning, not just springing new things on them at the last minute.
So they feel like they're part of the process. I like that.
Exactly. And it ties back to that whole transparency thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
When people understand the why behind the what, they're much more likely to be on board.
It's about building trust too, right?
Absolutely. And part of building trust is being willing to adjust your approach along the way.
You mean it's not about finding the perfect system and then never changing it?
Exactly. Things change, teams evolve,
Yeah.
and you got to be willing to adapt.
Okay, so it's a process of continuous improvement. I can get behind that.
And speaking of continuous improvement, Mastering team performance metrics really emphasizes that this isn't just about hitting some arbitrary target. It's about fostering a culture of growth.
Okay, now that's something I'm really interested in. How do you actually do that? Create a culture where people are constantly learning and growing.
It's definitely a journey, not a destination. But one thing I've found really helpful is to shift the focus from just hitting numbers to celebrating what you learn along the way.
So it's less about did we hit the target and more about what did we learn and how can we use that to do even better next time.
You got it. It's about creating a safe space for experimentation
Yeah.
where it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them.
That takes the pressure off, right? Allows people to be more creative and take risks.
Exactly. Now, of course, even with the best intentions, there are always challenges when it comes to implementing new things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like what? Give me the dirt.
Well, we've talked about data overload, which is a big one, but another common hurdle is resistance to change.
Yeah. People get stuck in their ways.
The book actually talks about that, how even when it's clear that the old ways aren't working, people still cling to them.
It's like that saying, if it ain't broke.
Don't fix it. But
Hmm.
sometimes things are broken and we just don't want to admit it.
So true. So what's the solution? How do we break through that resistance?
Right. Sometimes it's like we'd rather keep using a broken compass than risk trying a new one.
Hmm.
But the book actually offers some great strategies for overcoming that resistance. It all starts with getting people involved right from the beginning, not just springing new things on them at the last minute.
Makes sense. If they feel like they're part of the process, they're more likely to embrace it.
Exactly. It's not about dictating from on high, but about co-creating that roadmap for success together.
I like that a lot. It's about building trust too, right?
Absolutely. And part of building trust is being willing to adjust your approach along the way.
Uh-huh.
It's not about finding the perfect system and then never changing it.
Oh, I've definitely fallen into that trap before. It's like you spend all this time building this elaborate system, but then things change and you're stuck with something that's no longer working.
It's like using an old map when all the roads have changed. You'll never get where you need to go. You got to be willing to adapt.
Okay, so it's a process of continuous improvement. I can definitely get behind that.
And speaking of continuous improvement, mastering team performance metrics really emphasizes that this isn't just about hitting some arbitrary target. It's about fostering a culture of growth.
Okay, now that's something I'm really interested in. How do you actually do that? Create a culture where people are constantly learning and growing.
It's definitely a journey, not a destination. But one thing I found really helpful is to shift the focus from just hitting numbers to celebrating what you learn along the way.
So it's less about did we hit the target and more about what did we learn and how can we use that to do even better next time?
You got it. It's about creating a safe space for experimentation where it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them.
That takes the pressure off, right? Allows people to be more creative and take risks.
Exactly. But, even with the best intentions, we have to acknowledge that numbers don't tell the whole story.
Oh, for sure. We can't forget about the human side of things.
Right. Like we could track all the data in the world, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how someone's feeling or what kind of challenges they're facing on a personal level.
It's about recognizing that people aren't robots, right? They're not just cogs in a machine.
Exactly. And the book actually emphasizes the importance of balancing those quantitative metrics with regular check-ins and more qualitative feedback.
Makes sense. Get the full picture. How do you do that in your work?
Well, I'm a big fan of one-on-ones. Just having those dedicated conversations where you can really listen to what's going on for people. And not just about work, but about their lives outside of work, too.
Because it all ties in, right? Someone's
So-
personal life can definitely affect their work and vice versa.
Absolutely. And by creating that space for open and honest communication, you can build stronger relationships and a more supportive team culture overall.
It's like that saying, happy employees make for happy customers, or something like that.
Right. It all starts with the people.
Yep.
Now, before we wrap things up, there's one more important aspect of the modern workplace we need to touch on: remote and hybrid teams.
Oh, yeah. That's huge. I feel like almost everyone I know is working remotely at least part of the time now.
It's definitely becoming the norm, which presents unique challenges when it comes to performance measurement. How do you track performance when you don't see your team every day?
It's definitely trickier, and it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that out of sight means out of mind.
Right. But the book emphasizes that it's more important than ever to stay connected with your remote and hybrid team members and not just about work.
Right. Like you still want to have those water cooler moments, even if it's virtual.
Exactly. Schedule those virtual coffee breaks, encourage casual conversations online, whatever it takes to build those connections.
Because at the end of the day, we're all human, right? We crave connection.
Exactly. And when it comes to actual performance measurement, mastering team performance metrics suggests focusing on outcomes and value delivered rather than just hours logged.
Because who cares if someone's sitting at their computer for 8 hours straight if they're not actually getting anything done?
Right. It's about results, not just activity.
Hmm.
And speaking of the future, what are your thoughts on some of the emerging trends in performance measurement?
Ooh, this is where it gets really interesting. Have you heard about how AI is changing the game?
I've heard whispers.
It's pretty amazing. Imagine being able to analyze massive amounts of data and predict potential problems before they even happen.
That's like next level stuff.
Mhm.
No more putting out fires all the time.
Exactly. And beyond the technology itself, I think there's a growing awareness of the importance of employee well-being and its impact on performance.
Absolutely. It's not just about productivity anymore. It's about creating a work environment where people can thrive.
Totally. I'm really excited to see how this all evolves in the coming years.
Me too.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on the cusp of something really exciting. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into mass